Visuals? Check again. Nice. It's working here.
Thank you, Leah. Good, okay, great. Yes? All right. Hi. Just looked like we lost you. Okay, well, a very good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Harper. I've already met you, don't know me, and I'm the head of the research group here at School of Maths. I'm heading up some of the healthcare modelling work. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event. I think it's now the 7th or 8th, maybe 7th, one of these events in the Developing Mathematical Models in Healthcare seminar series. I've seen a lot of familiar faces, also seen a lot of new faces, so please welcome to you for the first time. So the whole point of this seminar series is really to promote and to get discussion around how mathematical models operational research could be and are being used in the health service. And so we're delighted for this particular event to welcome Daniel Thayer, who's come from Swansea University to talk about the cell Databank. You probably, I'm guessing most people here have heard about that, but Dan's going to explain how we can make better use of that very rich data source, answering research questions faster, which sounds like a good thing to me. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dan. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing with the SAIL Databank. I'm Dan Thayer, and I'm the Senior Research Analyst for the SAIL Databank, supporting a variety of research projects. And I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing, the capabilities of SAIL, and also some of the areas we need improvement. And you might notice a distinct lack of mathematical modeling in this talk, because actually I don't know much about it, but it is, I think, a very important related set of things, and there's a lot of modeling going on with SAIL, so I think it will be relevant. So I said it will be about the potential and challenges of linked data research, and I should just briefly start off by saying what at least I mean when I say linked data research. First of all, it's research that's using data that was collected for some other purpose, for something like operational uses or things. For health research, that would be things like hospital records or GP records that are just created in the process of giving care to people. They weren't intended for research, but they have a lot of potential. And also, it's linked data, meaning there's the method of there are methods of identifying the same person across different data sources. And I'm going to talk a little bit more later about how that works with SAIL. Then finally, the data is anonymized, which allows it to be used for research legally without obtaining consent, which allows kind of population-based research. And this is the sort of thing people are often referring to when they talk about big data. Although all the cool people know to say that they don't like the term big data because it's a buzzword. So if you want to sound like you know what you're talking about, say you don't like big data. Now, just to give a little bit of an overview of why this is different from the traditional way of doing research. In the traditional way of doing research, which I've called the old way, sorry if you're still doing it, you collect a sample, you identify a sample of people that you are going to study. And you have to usually go recruit these people or find them in some other way. And it's quite expensive to have more people in your study, so you usually try to identify the minimum number of people that you can use and find the result that you're interested in. But with linked data, because we're just collecting all of the data from all the hospitals in Wales, for example, we can just use the entire population as the source of research. Traditionally, of course, you have to go out and collect data for whatever it is you want to study. If you want to look at 10 years, you might have to wait 10 years for all the data to come into existence before you can find out the answer to your question. But we're using existing data that has been collected for a long time, and it's already there and in place. I think with traditional research, often you have to very well define exactly what you're going to do before you start out with your experiment, and without a lot of information at the time, possibly, of whether it's actually possible, whether it's going to be interesting. You could spend quite a lot of effort and then discover that there's something missing. But because we're working with data that's already there in place, there's more flexibility with how you do the research and what research questions you ask. Now, that can be a danger, but it's also a positive thing. Traditionally, I think there's a very strong separation between doing research and then putting it into practice. I mean, there are things like trials or studies that you do, and then you do them, complete them, you get the result, and then eventually, if you like the result, then you can go and change practice. But because we're using data that's actually in use operationally to provide care, there's a potential for a lot less separation between doing research and then actually using the results of those research in the field. Traditionally, I think if you do a study of 500 people and then you want to do 500 more people, it will be almost as much effort as the first 500. But when you're using routine data, like we have with SAIL, it can often be trivial to replicate the same study. If we did a study in, say, 2009, and we wonder, was that result still true today? Assuming that we were good and saved all our code correctly, we should be able to run it again in a few minutes on the new data. And if you did a study, say, with hospital data in Wales, and you wonder, is it true in England? It would be quite easy to run the same study using English data because their data in hospitals is quite similar to what's in Wales. So it increases the potential of replication, of seeing if the result applies in different times and places. And overall, I think this adds up to revolutionizing the way that research is done, that health research is done, because you can dramatically increase the scale of the populations you're looking at. You can go from samples to whole populations of millions of people. You can greatly increase the speed at which you do research because the data is already in place. Sorry about the curling image. I last gave this in Canada. I thought they would find it funny. They didn't. But anyway. Finally, for many of the same reasons, it greatly reduces the cost of doing research. And all of this adds up to a dramatic reduction in the difficulty of answering research questions when you have this kind of data available. Some of the implications of this, I think, it could speed up the cycle of innovation and unleash a new wave of innovation, because the faster you can answer one question, the faster you can move on to the next question. And even you can go beyond just answering one discrete research question and have systems even that learn and apply new knowledge instantly. There are things like this going on in the non-health world all over the place with people like Google and Amazon that have algorithms that learn and improve just as people use them. And the same sort of thing could be put into place in the health world, potentially taking advantage of the data that's there. But it's not just about speed, it's also about being able to answer new kinds of questions. You can answer questions that previously wouldn't be possible because you could never get the sample size that you needed. So you could detect very small effects or look at very rare conditions where you have to go through millions and millions of cases to find what you're looking for. It's also possible to combine data sources from very different places to answer questions that wouldn't be conceivable in the past. Suppose I wondered if children who do well on their exams when they're young and then eat lots of peanuts end up committing more crimes. Now, I don't know if anyone would want to study that, but you actually could using linked data. You could get education data, you could get something like a Tesco data set of what kind of groceries people buy, and you could get criminal justice data and combine them to answer questions that would have been impossible using a traditional method. And then because the cost is lower when using existing data, it means that there are more things that you can study. There are so many things that doctors are giving treatment that there actually is very little evidence about effectiveness, just because there's no way we'd have the resources to do all the clinical trials that would be needed. And if a treatment isn't used that often, then probably there aren't the resources to do a clinical trial on it. But using existing data, I think there's the potential to unlock many more things. So I hope this gives a picture of how I believe these techniques can transform research and really revolutionize it. And just to sum it up, what I've been saying so far, linked data research is a panacea that cures every problem. And it's instantly going to transform the way we do everything. And the great thing about this is because it's all computer-based, the computers are going to do all of the work. So it's going to be really, really easy to do. And obviously, it's going to make any other type of research obsolete. So that's really about all I have to say. But I would like to close just because it's hard to visualize this without seeing an example of how it works, just to give you an example of exactly what I mean. So in order to do linked data research, you obviously need some data. And then what you need is you press this button, and then the next step is that the results you want come out. Now, one of the realities of this kind of research is people come to it always thinking it's going to be much easier than it actually is. And especially, we like to joke at sales that our bosses are the ones who always think it's going to be much easier than it is. They'll stop by our desk, and if we're unlucky enough to be there at the time, then they'll say, oh, I have this great idea that could you just quickly look at this? And oh, by the way, it's really easy because the data's there, so could you take a look at it this afternoon? So we start to look at this question, but the first thing we might discover is that actually it's really hard to identify what people we want to study to answer a question, because we just have millions and millions of people in the database. Which ones are the right ones for this study? So it ends up taking more time than we expect. And then we discover there's a problem where the data doesn't have complete coverage, and that makes it really hard it's hard to figure out how to handle that. We have people moving in and out of the data. It's hard to tell when they're in the data. So that adds more complexity to the study. Then we discover that there may be some confounding factors or things that are influencing the result that we need to account for. And we might also discover some errors in the data that we have to handle in some way. And then, of course, we do all of the work preparing the data and hand it to the statistician and say, oh, you can have this by tomorrow, right? But we discover that the statistical analysis has become very complicated because of all these other factors, making the analysis more complex. So what seems very easy at the beginning ends up taking a very long time. And we often find that people are spending years to answer single research questions, even using linked data. And really, it's because there's a variety of different types of complexity with this type of work. There's a complexity that comes from just the volume of the data that you have that has to be understood and processed. And often people, when they see all the data that's available, kind of get greedy and want to use every single data source in their study because it might be interesting. So then you have a huge amount to deal with and understand. And there's also a complexity that comes from the task of translation. Because in this type of research, we're taking something that was created for one purpose and trying to use it now for another purpose. something like a GP notes weren't created with research in mind. And they might work great for the purpose they were intended for, but there are questions of how they can be converted into something that works for research. There's a lot of complexity with that, and we spend a lot of time figuring out how to measure the things we want and things like that. And then there are also issues of the quality and completeness of the data. Is the thing that we're interested in recorded well, and so on. And a lot of this comes, again, from using the data for a different purpose. I mean, the quality of the data might be great for the original operational purpose, and yet the thing you'd really want to know for research just isn't important to them, so it's not there, or you have to come up with a creative way to measure it. Oops. Then there's also complexity that just comes from all the different kinds of expertise that are needed to do this kind of work. You need clinicians who know about the disease or condition you're trying to study. You need operational experts who know about the data systems that are being used that collect the data. How is the data collected? What do the codes mean? And so on. You need experts in research and statistics, as well as technical things like software and hardware needed for this kind of work. And then all of these factors, I think, combine together to add to the analytical complexity. So it still is taking a long time to answer questions that we're interested in, even though the data is already there. It's just we're spending the time on different things. And the question is there a better way to do this? How can we improve this process? And I'm going to put that aside for a moment, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the SAIL Databank and what we're doing, and then try to come back to this question of how we can improve the process. The SAIL Databank, again, I was giving this in Canada, so I have to show where Wales is. It's been operating since 2006, and it's held by Swansea University, and we work closely with the National Health Service, especially the NHS Wales Informatics Service. And it's a collection of mainly health data sets covering the Welsh population, although we're also expanding into other non-health areas of data like education, social care, and so on. It's primarily based on the Welsh population, and from a population of about 3 million, that results in having about 5 million different individuals and about 10 billion records in the database right now. And we're also part of UK-wide collaborations that go beyond Wales, including the FAR Institute, which is focused on health data across the UK, and the Administrative Data Research Network, which is focused on non-health data like work and pensions data and things. And in both of these, Cardiff University is a partner with us in these collaborations. Now, here's an overview of some of the data sets that we hold within SAIL. We hold birth and death information from the Office of National Statistics. The primary population data source that we use is the Welsh Demographic Service, which is based on everyone in Wales who has received care or been registered with a GP. And then we have the patient episode database for Wales, which is all of the hospital admissions in Wales, and including hospital admissions for Welsh residents who get treated in England. We also have outpatient data and primary care data and emergency department data. There's also a National Community Child Health Database that has information on birth and early childhood. We also hold the education data for Wales, and there are a number of disease-specific registers focusing on things like cancer and other things. So that's just an overview of some of the data sources we have. And in addition, many projects bring in other data sources related to the projects to link to this. And most of our data sets that we hold have coverage of the Welsh population. The one exception is the primary care data set, because each GP practice is the holder of their own data, so they have to each individually agree to sign up. And we have in the past historically had 40% of the population in sale, but we have over 70% of practices have agreed to submit data and are going to be submitting data to us soon. And in addition to having broad coverage, we also have a large amount of historical data. We have hospital data going back to 1999. The outpatient data is a bit more recent, but we still have well over 10 years of historical data. And for the GP practices, it all depends on when they started using computers and so on. But usually we have at least 15 or so years of data at each practice. And then the A&E data set is more recent. We have it since 2009. And most of these data sets are now updated monthly, so there isn't that long of a time lag between when something is recorded and when we get it. Although in some cases there is more of a time lag at the source. So that's an overview of the data. Now this data comes into SAIL using a process of anonymization, which is called the split file process. And this ensures that no person in the process ever sees both the identifiable information and the clinical data that's associated with it, which helps preserve the anonymity of the data. So at the source, if someone has a file to submit to SAIL, then they split this file into two portions: a clinical portion containing all of the health-related information, for example, and then an information with all the demographic details. Now, the demographic details are sent to NWIS, who anonymize this using a matching algorithm that is based on NHS number and then matching on other demographic fields if NHS number isn't present. And then the clinical information is sent directly to SAIL, and we receive an anonymized ID, which we can attach to the clinical information. And what this does is it results in each person having a unique ID within the system that it links across all of the data sets. And in addition, if a project wants to bring new data in, they can use the same process, get the same ID, and therefore link to all of the existing data very easily. Now, one thing that is very important about this type of work is governance. And God bless the people that enjoy this sort of thing. But it really is the foundation of this kind of work, because this is all dependent on being able to ensure that the data is used properly and it's anonymous and there's no risk of disclosing people's identities, because without that, we wouldn't have the right to use the data. So I already talked about the anonymization of the data. We also have an independent panel that considers all of the applications to use the data, and it has representatives from different organizations that submit data. This is somewhat unique in that there's a single application process to access all of the data sets that SAIL holds, which is not the case when you're doing this kind of work in most other places. And then we give projects access to an encrypted extract of the data, meaning that they only get the data that they need for their project, and it wouldn't be linkable to any other data because we had an extra layer of encryption. And then the work is carried out in a secure remote desktop environment. So we don't actually release the data out of our environment, but you connect to us and use it, and therefore it helps maintain control and appropriate use of the data. And then there's someone who manually reviews any outputs you want before you can take them out of the system and publish them. And by someone, I mean me. Now, one question that we get a lot, so I think I should address it, is actually, what do you do if you want to use SAIL? How does that process work? So the first step in working with SAIL is really coming to us in a more informal way with an idea, and we help determine if the idea will actually work. Because actually, we've had a lot of experience of people coming up with a very well-formed, complicated, great idea, but the data isn't there. So it's much better to kind of have an informal conversation and find out what data is available and what would be possible. And we also can help determine what the cost will be for supporting the project. We don't charge anything for the use of the data, but we do have to charge for the amount of time it takes us to support projects. And then after that stage, you fill out an application that goes to the review panel who consider your application. And if your application is approved, then any loading of the data set, if there's any data coming in for your project, it gets loaded. And then finally, you're granted access to the project in a secure area and you can work on the project. And how long does this all take? It probably takes about 3 or 4 months to get started with using SAIL from initially contacting us if everything moves along smoothly. And how long does it take to do the analysis? At SAIL, we work with a variety of different groups, users. We work with academic people, we work with the NHS and government, and also with commercial users of the data. Really, in theory, most anybody can work with us, but it has to be a legitimate research project with the potential for public benefit. And one limitation that we have is that it can't be used for performance management purposes, like publishing league tables of hospitals or something like that, because that's deemed to be not within our remit, but it's really to be used for research. And also, because of the sensitivity, we don't allow pharmaceutical companies to access the data directly, but they have to work with like an independent partner, like an academic partner. Now, what kinds of research are going on with SAIL? There's a number of types of things, and traditional observational studies are a lot of what's going on. Some of these are based purely on data that we hold. One example that I worked on was a study of the safety of medication in pregnancy, which we also did in conjunction with a variety of different European countries. But then some other studies then bring in their own cohort of patients and link it to SAIL data. An example of this would be a diabetes study that brought in the type 1 diabetes register and then looked at the outcomes of children in terms of hospital admissions. There are also a number of potential uses of SAIL alongside traditional clinical trials. One thing that it could be used for is for supplemental data. A lot of clinical trials just need background information on things like participants' health or service usage, which they might collect quite laboriously through surveys or through accessing people's records. But using routinely collected data is a potentially much easier and maybe a better quality way of doing this sort of thing. And also it could be used to provide secondary outcomes or look at more extended outcomes alongside the primary outcome of the trial. There was one example of this was the PROBAT study, which was a study of probiotic supplements in infancy. And using routine data, this study was able to look at a longer period of follow-up than the study could do through traditional methods. So they added some extra years of looking into the follow-up using this data. And finally, one area that has a lot of potential is that SAIL could be used for trial feasibility. Like, are there enough patients available to do a clinical trial? Is always one of the big questions at the beginning, and the SAIL data has a potential to answer that, and we're exploring that possibility. Another thing that SAIL is used for quite a bit are service evaluations. One that I've been involved with was the Air Aware project, which around Port Talbot, there are a number of air quality monitors near the steelworks. And they have had a pilot project of sending people text messages or emails when the air quality is bad. And then routine data is being used to evaluate whether this has any effect on health outcomes. And there also have been several different uses of SAIL to look at housing interventions, such as does an intervention to increase energy efficiency in homes have any effect on health outcomes? And then we're also involved in some projects for supporting health providers directly, working directly with NHS to answer questions that are of interest to them. And we really have a goal to get more closely involved with NHS partners because we really want this work to have more of an impact and really meet needs in the health service. We've been part of a small business research initiative with ABMU Health Board, where some small companies have proposed innovative ideas to meet the health board's needs, and then they're in a competition to see how that, to see which one is the most effective use of data to support a health board. And we also did a project, we're still doing it actually, to provide analysis supporting GP practices, looking at questions that are important to them. They have specific areas that they're supposed to focus on, and we've been working to provide reports that send a report to each practice showing them things about their practice as well as the rest of Wales. And to just give an example of a SAIL project, I'm going to use one of these GP engagement reports that we've been working on. GPs are required to place people that they believe are near the end of life on a palliative care register. And this is a particular area of focus recently. And they're also encouraged to have discussions with patients who are near the end of life about their preference for the end of life. And they're supposed to create an advanced care plan about the patient's preference. Now, obviously, the end of life can be quite traumatic thing, and to better help meet patients' needs at that point is a very important goal. And so that's what it's kind of working toward. And so to support this, we produced a report for GPs about palliative care at their practice, as well as in Wales. And this used some of the data sets I referred to before. We obviously use primary care data as the main source for this study, but we also linked it to ONS deaths information, which tells about the cause of death. And we also linked to hospital data, which tells whether or not a patient died in hospital, as well as some demographic information about the patients at each practice. Now, just to illustrate the sort of issues that you run into when doing research with linked data, one of the issues when using primary care data is what codes should you use to identify the events you're interested in. GP records are coded with something called read codes, which, believe it or not, has over 300,000 unique codes, obviously in a very well-organized structure. And then some things you might be interested in are not recorded at all, because a doctor could write something down with a code, or they could just write something down in the notes. And we don't receive the free text notes because it's potentially identifiable. They could put, Bob is a real complainer in the notes, and then we'd know the patient's name was Bob, as well as other information. So some of the things we were interested in, such as advanced care plans, were actually not really recorded using coding, which meant we couldn't really study that. And then another key thing we ran into is we were interested in whether patients actually died in their preferred place of death. A problem here was that that preference is not actually recorded anywhere in coded data. So the solution we came up with to address that is using death in hospital as a proxy. It's not the same thing, but there's some relationship, because the thought was that few patients are going to say, I prefer to die in hospital. So we produced a report for each practice that is signed up to SAIL, showing how they're recording the relevant events, as well as showing the cause of death among patients at their practice, and their practice's use of the palliative care register, as well as showing what's going on in their health board in Wales. And one interesting thing is we found that there is an association between practices having greater use of the palliative care register and lower rate of death in hospital, which is, there's a small but significant relationship between the two, which is a potentially interesting finding. It might suggest that the palliative care register actually makes a difference in care and is having a good effect, although more would be needed to determine whether there's causality there. So that's just a brief example of the kind of thing you could use SAIL to study and some of the challenges you run into when doing one study. Now, to go back to this question of how can we make things work better, I think my goal, is to meet people's unrealistic expectations about how easy it is to use the data. So if people think you should be able to do a study using the data in a few hours, well, why not? The data is all there already. And I think there's a reason to think that it may actually be possible, and that is because there's a lot of complexity, but handling complexity is what computers are good at, and especially when there's similarity and repeating the same things. And I find that a lot of people are doing very similar things over and over with SAIL when they do research. Many studies use a design that looks like this, which is a basic cohort study design. They have a data set and they identify some people out of it that they're interested in, but there may be things that you have to handle, like errors in the data or missing data and things like that. But the thing is that if there's a problem with the data, most likely any study using it is going to have to solve that same problem. So you could theoretically solve it once and not have to solve it every single time. And then out of those people you're interested in, some of them may have some condition that you're interested in or been exposed to something. Well, the way that you define that is often very similar. If you're using hospital data, it's going to be based on someone's diagnosis, probably. So there's a lot of potential to reuse what has been done here. And also then the actual analysis tends to be quite similar each time. But what we find is that everybody is doing the same thing from scratch every single time, or reinventing the wheel. So how can we work better? And we've been thinking a lot about this and developing some techniques for this. And the first thing I think has to do with better ways of gathering knowledge about the data. What is in the data, what the problems with it are, where it comes from. And people are doing studies with SAIL and they're learning lessons and discovering, oh, this code is wrong, or oh, this field means that. And yet there's no good way to really share that systematically so that everyone else can build on that knowledge next time instead of having to learn the same lessons again. And so we've been developing ways to help people more easily share their knowledge about the data. Wiki documentation that everyone can contribute to. Information about the quality of the data and what's in it that can be shared. And then we have working groups that gather around specific topics and try to come up with a good solution to common problems that people are dealing with. One example of this is smoking. Everybody wants to measure smoking status for their study because it's such an important factor on health that almost everybody wants to control for it or account for it in some way. But it's actually quite hard to measure whether someone is a smoker or not, because there are hundreds and hundreds of different codes related to smoking. Different GPs use different kinds of codes, use them in a different way. And then also people lie about their smoking, or they quit smoking and start and quit and start again. So we find all sorts of conflicts in the data as well. And then also things like this are affected by policy changes, like requirements that GPs record the smoking data in a certain way. You know, it could be that it looks like suddenly more people are smoking, but it could be just a policy that says you have to record smoking. So how do you deal with all of this complexity? This is just a peripheral issue to most studies. They don't have time to spend a huge amount of time figuring all this out, and yet it could be a complex project in itself. So the goal is to come up with the best solution for things like this and just provide them to studies to use. And that's what's been going on now. We have a working group that's been looking at this and intends to publish a paper on the best way to measure smoking status, and then also provide code that people can use for this purpose. So that's the first step, is just being able to gather knowledge about the data. But I think we want to go beyond that and actually make the result of that knowledge available in the data and ready to use. And we have goals to develop cleaned versions of the data sets that we hold in SAIL that solve common problems. They're informed by experts who've been working with the data, so that people don't have to keep dealing with the same issues over and over again. And in addition, they can add derived information that might be useful to researchers, such as a simple variable that tells you smoking status would be an example. And one of the goals here is to not make these replace the existing data, but be added as a new layer, because you always want to be able to go back and see what the raw data looks like and understand what the process was of deriving the data that you're using. There's a lot of work that's been going on in this area in child health, where there's a child health database that's complex, derived from multiple systems across Wales. And then there's information in many other databases that also are interesting for child health. There's a project called the Dynamic Welsh Electronic Cohort for Children that has a goal of gathering and cleaning all the child health information into a clean data set that people can easily use for studies. And that's been going on, and it's already been used for a number of different research questions. Then finally, in addition to that, I would like to see an easier way of working with the data. I think, you know, right now, one of the barriers to doing research is you have to know how to write code and develop complex algorithms to actually get something out of the data. But there could be a lot easier ways to work with it. And we've been working on proposals to develop a front end to the data that allows you to access it in a more user-friendly way. It could potentially allow you to just explore the data and see what's in it, go beyond that to actually do preparation of the data and analysis. And what I mean is something like this, you could have an interface that is much easier to work with than writing a whole bunch of code. And that's the goal that we really have, to develop something that we think will unlock a lot more use of the data. And there are a lot of existing tools out there that this could build upon. And we want to design it in a way that can be shared not just with SAIL, but with people doing this kind of work in other locations. So it won't be dependent on specific data that we hold. And we think this is a way to enable doing studies across different data sources. I talked about the FAR Institute and other collaborations we have across the UK. We have a goal to do studies across the UK on many different data sources, but that's quite hard to do in practice. So we want to build a way to do this more easily. And we've already begun some software development to help automate things that analysts do right now. One of the complicated questions we have is understanding when someone is present within primary care data, because as I mentioned, we only hold some of the data sets. We only hold some of the practices in Wales, and people move their registration to different practices all the time. So you could have a case where someone moves to a practice that we have data for, then they move to a practice we don't have data for. They move back into our data, then they move outside of Wales entirely, then they move back in. There's an extremely complicated history that each individual has potentially. And we've developed an algorithm to simplify that and give you an easy answer of when someone is present in the data. Also, similarly, when is someone resident in Wales? And these are used by lots of different studies. And also, we've developed code to create a matched control group, do things like the Charleston Comorbidity Index, which is important for many health studies. And the goal is really to have software and research support structures that are integrated together into one process, which enables researchers to focus on doing their research, not focus on how do I write this SQL query. And also, I think the knowledge gathering systems will enable the quality of the research we do to improve continually, because it will make it much easier to build on things that people have already learned and get better. And I say, why not? You should be able to do go from idea to a result in one afternoon. And I'd like to thank people who've been involved with this. And thank you for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dan, for a very comprehensive talk. I think also from our perspective in mathematical modeling, this linked data sets heralds an exciting new era for us in terms of populating our models and system view models and so forth. So it's not been possible before. So this is why we got you here. It's exciting, I think. As Dan said, are there any questions? Time for some questions.
So, that's an interesting idea, and I think there's a lot of potential for that. I think the main thing about the performance management is really comparing people to each other is the thing that we have to avoid. And so if one practice was just comparing their own results to themselves over time, there wouldn't be any barrier to doing that sort of thing, I think. Yeah. Yeah, so what we've done is just given each practice a result about their own practice, but of course they would be happy to show that to others if they want to. I mean, theoretically, no, there wouldn't be a barrier to repeating it regularly, and that it's quite easy to make it fairly automated, so it's not a lot of work to do. I mean, there'd be a fair piece of work to set that up in the first place. But, I mean, we're definitely interested in that sort of thing, actually having results that feed back into changing and supporting what's going on in healthcare provision. So we'd definitely be interested in.
Problem then is you've embedded expert bias. NASA had all the data on atmospheric. One idiot sat in Antarctica who was actually measuring things said,
that data set to become the core data set that all of us enough data, because we've modified it to look like an expert's protection for drive improvement. Not a model that fits. You have to start with the facts as they are.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
just a bit worried about the demystified project.
well, that's definitely a major danger of any kind of data cleaning, and we're quite aware of that. And I think the solution to that is really, first of all, transparency and documentation of exactly what has been done, and secondly, always providing the original data as well, so people can look at it and make their own decision about whether they agree or not with what has been done. But realistically, I mean, there has to be some kind of storing of these sorts of things, because individual projects just don't have the resources to address all of the different issues in the data on an individual basis. Another important thing in this space also is validation of the data from external sources, and that's something that we try to do when possible. Some projects build that into what they're doing.
Fascinating talk. Okay, so for the second half, it's something a bit different this time. We received some feedback from previous events, and so we're going to introduce our event tonight. You know who's going to talk about what's going next.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So we're going to try something. They're called lightning talks. Has anyone ever seen lightning talks before? Okay, so these are very often done at software conferences, and the idea is there is no plan. So the plan is that everyone has 3 minutes to speak, and it'll be a very strict 3 minutes. I'm going to kind of host this, and so with 10 seconds to go, I'll start doing this. When you see me start doing this, you should all start doing this. We're clapping with our fingers. Have a go. Right? And then once we go through those 10 seconds, then we clap. So everyone knows how to do it, okay? And that basically kicks off whoever is currently speaking. You have a strict 3 minutes to speak. What we've done for this first one, we've lined up about 12 lightning talks, I think is the number. Yeah. But ideally in the future, we won't have such a plan, and everyone can just come and speak. I mean, it doesn't have to be something too rigorous, but of course it can be. It can be something that's someone has found interesting. You can have slides on a stick. You can not have slides. It's very much an open process. Is that okay? Do you have any questions?
Yeah, if I've got a question about the lightning talk, am I allowed to raise it then, or do I have to wait?
You're very much allowed to speak, but given that the person has only got 3 minutes to talk, they probably won't spend time answering you. So if you had a question, I would suggest you just note it down and then go speak to the person afterwards. Okay. Geraint, you kindly said you'll drive this for me. Just reset it. The people who are going to speak will basically form a queue. You don't all have to stand up at the same time, but as people are going, come join. If anyone else would like to speak, by all means join the queue as well. They'd be very much welcome. And then in the meantime, let me close this so we don't get confused. Close this. So everyone who's giving a lightning talk, your slides are already here. So I'll let you go ahead. So
Count of time.
we won't make it count. So once I say you're ready. So the first talk is by Paul. Go on.
Okay, great. this is a talk about the right handbook. It's actually a handbook. It's also a web-based version. It's a selection framework. The idea being that someone in the health service says, I've got this type of problem. This is the kind of time I have, money to spend on it. And the idea it would be like a matching process to say which kind of OR technique would be useful. So it came out of a piece of funded research several years ago now from EPSRC with the following partners there. It's published by Cambridge University Press. Okay, so what is the workbook? Or who is the workbook for? It's intended to provide guidance for people who are making decisions in healthcare, decision makers. It's aimed to find out more about modeling techniques. It's not about how to do, but it's to point you in the right direction. So we had a lot of work and time talking to people in the health service. We've read a lot of literature, thousands of papers in different areas where ORs use in military, defense sector, and so forth. And we came up eventually by looking at the literature and speaking to people like yourselves with a list of 28 techniques, which is a fairly comprehensive list, but by no means exhaustive list. The idea then being they can be kind of categorized into one of 4 high-level things: problem structuring, conceptual modeling, mathematical modeling, simulation. Some of these techniques you'll hear more about through other Lightning talks, I believe. The idea being then, this is a lot of words, but we basically pin down areas of where modeling could be used into these kind of characterized by application areas, whether you're working in policy, quality management, risk management, and so on. It's all in the handbook. I haven't got time to explain. The idea is that you map, for a particular technique, it would map across to where that would be applicable in certain domains. Likewise, again, there's a web-based version of this. The idea is you say, well, how much time have I got to make this decision? I'm going to do it by today, or I've got a week or a year. How much funds have I got to do it? I'm on a budget, I've got no money, or I've got money I can spend on research. Do I have any knowledge of this problem? Is it a new problem to me, or is it something I've done before? What level of insight do I require? Is it very policy level, or at one level, high level? Or is it very detailed operational at the other end of the spectrum? And what do I want from the model? I want just some broad insights, rough ideas, or do I want some very accurate information? So the idea, again, it's all in here. I've just chosen a few example pages, decision trees. It tells you whereabouts on those scale of those 4 domains it lies. So you've got decision trees, things like drama theory, which are much more kind of systems level. You've got game and simulation, inference diagrams where you have very little data, and so forth, and so on. You've also got a web tool there, which you can look at. You can fill in those questions, slider bars. It will then plot what you've put in, and there's a nice matching algorithm which will come up with a whole range of possible fits to your problem. Thank you.
Okay. So the next speaker is Jenny. I realize it's a theoretic. So there's actually a guy in Germany whose job, he does this professionally, hosting these lightning talks. His website is the Lightning Talk Guy, and he was very funny. So sadly, you just have me. Go ahead, Jenny.
Thank you, Vince. I'm Jenny Morgan. I'm going to be talking about problem structuring, specifically about causal mapping. Paul's already mentioned it very briefly on his slide. Generally, when we talk about operational research methods, we think of a spectrum of methods. We can think of qualitative to quantitative methods. So what I'm going to be talking about is more of a soft method, more qualitative. But it's essentially to ask yourself, how on earth am I going to tackle this problem, address this situation? Oh, no, sorry, it's counting down. Sorry. If you're faced with a particular problem, particular system, you want to think about what methodology do I want to use to actually address this problem. So thinking about being in the middle of London and we want to navigate our way around, we might use a tube map, for instance, to navigate our way around London. But most people know that a tube map in London doesn't actually reflect the reality of the geography of the system. So it might be that that geographical map is more appropriate, or we might just be interested in a very particular route, a particular train link, or we might just be interested in the timetable. So on that note, we might need to think about what is it that we're actually trying to achieve. So what are our goals, our outcome for our particular project? What are we trying to do? And what are our options, issues, or strategies that we might use to actually address that particular goal? So this is a real dummy example here, but essentially the arrows are causal links or means. So for example, we might be interested in ensuring equitable access to cancer care across the population. One of the issues or strategies that we might identify to relate to that would be the effective referral systems that are in place. So that might be about ensuring that there are a sufficient number of GPs in deprived areas in order to address the entirety of the population. And that might actually be a particular issue around the attractiveness of postings of GPs. So this is just a very quick overview of what causal mapping is and how you might actually use it to address that particular goal and map out a problematic system. So I've flown through that. Thank you.
Okay, Julie, go ahead and set up. So this gentleman who's actually a professional at this is very good at it and tells funny jokes and whatnot and keeps everyone entertained. But I'll tell you more about him later. Go ahead, Julie.
Hi, so as most of you know, I'm Julie and I'm here today to talk to you about forecasting. So in a nutshell then, forecasting is the process of making predictions of the future based on past data and present analysis of trends. So suppose you've got this very simple scenario here where you know the demand for a service over the previous 7 months, and from this you want to project realistic estimations of demand for coming months. So forecasting allows you to do this by analysing past trends and building a statistical model for these alongside expert opinions and judgment to give realistic expectations of future demand. So demand forecasting is actually an essential part of capacity planning in the NHS, as it allows management to have projections of what staffing needs could be useful to have in the future and to match demand and capacity at the right times. For example, if you know that there's going to be very high demand one month, you can try and divert some demand elsewhere or bring in extra capacity, or conversely, try and plan elective surgery for periods which you know are going to be much quieter in the hospital. So why predict then? In healthcare at the moment, there's massive changes in demographic shifts and rapidly changing policies. So it's no longer adequate to just think that demand this year is going to be similar to demand last year. So it's really encouraging to see lots of healthcare organisations moving towards using more demand forecasting techniques. Predicting the immediate healthcare needs are difficult enough, let alone what's going to happen down the road. So statistical models can be used to try and forecast demand for certain devices in hospitals, patient demand, or even when and where to plan new healthcare facilities. So the type of time series method or focusing model you employ depends on your data. If there's a lot of periodicities and cyclical patterns, it's very easy to forecast future demand, but difficulty creeps in if there might be a lot of uncertainty or fluctuations. So for example, this is my graph here of ambulance demand in the future over the past 4 years, and there's a lot of uncertainty around this. A&E demand, however, is very predictable. As you can see here, it's highly dependent on the time of day and the day of week. So there's a lot of way we can capacity plan and try and match demand to match capacity to demand. There's a lot of different forecasting methods available. I don't have the time to go through them all here, but there are qualitative methods that can be based on expert judgment, quantitative methods which are using historical data to predict the future, and causal methods which also thank you
very much.
Okay,
Right. Go ahead and get set up, Jason. So yeah, do take the opportunity to come speak to us. We're all kind of here. This is how things work. So don't worry, this doesn't count, right? Control L, I think. Okay, go ahead, Jason.
Hello, my name is Jason Young, and today I'm going to talk to you about classification trees. Now, classification trees are a way we can make predictions from a given data set. So for the purpose of this, I've created a database of patients here. You can see that they've got the name and some information about them. Now, the prediction we want to make about this particular data set is whether or not these incoming patients have say, a disease. And here we have whether or not they do have a disease, but obviously we wouldn't know that for an incoming patient. Now, in 3 minutes, it's a little hard to visualize precordial pain or minor cognitive.
MCI.
MCI. So what we'll be doing is predicting whether an arriving shape has a particular disease. So now we have a database of shapes, and we'll see if we can use a classification tree to correctly predict whether or not they have the disease. So a classification tree attempts to split the data set into particular classes by repeatedly asking questions. So about our arriving shapes, the first thing we might want to know, what shape are they? If the shape is a triangle, we make the prediction that they do have disease. Otherwise, we'll have to ask another question. So if we do reach the say where they're not a triangle, we then ask what color are they? And if they're red, we predict they have disease. If they're not red, we predict that they are indeed healthy. So the way you ask those questions is you want to try and get as pure, the end of these nodes to be as pure as possible. So we only have diseased here, only have healthy and diseased here in each particular node. How you can actually use these trees is for an arriving shape, you can just ask those questions. So it's a very easy to interpret model. So if you have a green triangle arrive into our accident and emergency, we can instantly predict that they do have the disease. However, if you have a blue circle, we can then follow down the tree and correctly classify that that would be healthy. Now, there is a bit of a danger of you can just ask questions till every single arriving shape is only in its own little box, which is overfitting. However, we can, with a smaller tree, you get a better model, but however, sometimes the shapes are not correctly classified like here. And so that's how you can use a classification tree to predict certain information. We can bring this back now to our original data. And as I mentioned before, a classification tree, the main strength of it is the interpretability of the model. You can present that to anybody basically, and they can use that model as intended. Thank you very much.
Jason?
Oh, yeah. So we did a session of these at a conference in Namibia, and the guy who was leading on it just kept on control L. Kept on starting a story and not finishing it. But anyway, I'll tell you about that later.
Cool. Right. I'm going to talk about a technique I used in my master's thesis, which was linear programming. So I'm going to strip it right down to what I learned in my undergraduate, which was if I have a very simple problem like this. So if I have two types of paints that I can produce, and I make £50 profit on paint A, £60 profit on paint B, but paint A takes a certain amount of resource X to make and a certain amount of resource Y, and the same for paint B. But these resources are limited. So what's the best combination of how much of A and how much of B to produce for me to maximize my profit? So the main part of linear programming is converting this wordy problem into a mathsy problem, which is done here. So I want to maximize my profit. So I'm going to make £50 for every ton of A I make. So A represents how many tons of paint A, plus the £60 of B. And I know I'm going to make, I'm going to use up 4 tons of material X for every ton of A, and 6 tons of material X for every ton of B I make. And I know there's only 24 tons of material X available to me, and the same for material Y. So how can I choose A and B so that this is maximized? What I do, these look like the equation of a straight line, so I can plot them. So if I've got A down the bottom, how much of A I'm producing, how much of B I'm producing. The first constraint, which the blue I made, was this. So if I'm up here somewhere, if I'm making this much A and this much B, then I've got two. I haven't got enough of material X to be able to do this. So I can only choose values in this area. The same for material X. So now I can only choose values in this area. So from this area, what's the values that's going to maximize my profit? My profit is not a line, but we do have the gradient of the line. So the gradient of the line looks a bit like this. And if you look down here, we have this 0, 0. So producing no A and no B, it's going to give me no profit. So up here is a lot better. So what I want to do is push this line to the furthest extreme that I can make it, which is here, and that's how I work out the optimal amount of A and B to produce. What I did for my master's thesis was do this very multidimensional. I had loads and loads of constraints. It looked a bit like this in the end, just to show I did actually do some work. And I got a surgery schedule thing.
Thank you, Geraint. That was almost as exciting as Geraint's first ever lightning talk, where people were looking at me going, is he really trying to do this in however many minutes we have? Go ahead, Lizzie.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Lizzie. I'm just in the final stages of my PhD right now. This, however, was work I carried out for my MSc about 4 years ago, looking into workforce skill mix optimization. So basically, you've got some sort of healthcare team. Who do you need in it? So which kind of skills do you need in it? And how many of each person or of each type of skill do you need in your team? So you can approach this problem as a kind of supply and demand problem. Your supply is your healthcare team, and your demand can be, for example, your patients, different patient groups, that kind of thing. So it can be quite complicated. So in your supply, your healthcare team, you've got different skilled nurses, for example. They might only be able to do certain jobs, so they can't do all jobs. They can't service all of your demand, only a subset of your demand. They might also not be able to work every day of the week. You know, you can only put them on a Saturday and not a Monday, that kind of thing. So there's quite a few rules and subsets of supply. And similarly, there's quite a few subsets of demand. So you can categorize your patients into different medical needs, different time needs, any kind of categorization of your patients. And then there's this kind of mapping between your supply and demand. So which nurses can see which patients, that kind of thing. So you can use linear programming, like Geraint was just talking about, to kind of put in that mapping. Also put in constraints on the number of people you can have. Might be a cost constraint. You can't employ everybody you would like to. So, you know, how can I maximize my pot of money? So I applied it in my MSc to the district nursing service in Cardiff. This is what the teams looked like when I came to this project. So basically the different colours are different bands of nurses. So different amounts of different nurses in each team in Cardiff. There's a growing population getting older, so the demand for this service is increasing. But, you know, how can we possibly restructure our teams in order to better service that demand? So basically what I did was I simulated demand, you know, generated a snapshot of what I might see in the future. I'm not sure if you've got a simulation talk coming up, but that can be next time. And then I used linear programming to do my optimal skill mix.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Okay, so he'll be speaking next. I hope you're enjoying these. These are usually the part of the conference I prefer, to be honest. I think it's nice and fast-paced. So don't worry, it hasn't started yet. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. I don't know how to use that. Okay. You do? I'm going to talk a little bit about routing problem. First of all, let me define what is routing. It's basically how to serve a number of customers with a certain number of with a certain number of vehicles. For example, you know, you're in NHS, you want to do some blood collection using 10 vehicles. So you dispatch early morning from 8 a.m. your vans or mobile clinics to here and there, and you want to finish by 5 p.m. So where to route these vehicles and how much time each of them should serve in each of the neighborhoods is a problem. It has many applications in blood collection, distribution of medical supplies to pharmacies, ambulance services, and screening services. It's really a challenging problem. There are many parameters to be considered, but imagine this is the city. I just have grids here. So each of these grids, each of these squares are neighborhood in the city. So if you want to dispatch your ambulances, you prefer to dispatch them to these darker areas where there are more and more people to just maximize the uptake of service. But actually, the problem is the heat map of the heat map of population, or actually the population density in different periods of time, change, throughout the day. So it makes the problem really difficult. Okay. I want to finish in 2 minutes. That's all. Yeah. So this is a sample output. Imagine wherever your vehicle goes, people in the vicinity of 1 kilometer can come to your service, can come to your vehicle and get served. So our vehicle starts here for 2 blocks of time. Each block of time is like, say, 15 minutes. For half an hour, it goes there, stays there for 45 minutes, and serves everybody who is in this circle. Therefore, 15 minutes, it's on the way to this node, and they serve all the people here for 45 minutes. Therefore, half an hour travels here, for 2 hours it's there, and goes back. So actually, the main problem is how to route these vehicles, how many vehicles we need. And this figure, you see that we have 3 vehicles, 1, 2, 3, and each of them have its own route. That's a sample. 45 seconds. That's all.
Thank you very much. So hopefully this is proving to be a nice collection of techniques and acquisition of the sort of mathematical modeling that can be done. Right. I need to get back to that other story as well. Go ahead, Isabel.
Hi, I'm Isabella, and I'm going to talk to you what queuing theory is and where it can be used. So, apparently, British love to queue, and I'm sure most of you have been queuing in the past. So whether it's queuing to pay for your grocery, queuing to buy the latest already out of date Apple product, queuing at the airport, or queuing to find out that you don't have talent. So I gave you day-to-day life examples, but there's actually a lot of queuing in healthcare. So for example, queuing in walking outpatient clinic, or queuing in our favorite A&E. So these 2 examples are kind of, you can see a lot of people queuing. Queues are observable in a way. But also when you ring out of hours, you might wait for initial triage, and then you might wait for a doctor to call you back, and then maybe a nurse to call you back. So you are queuing. And similarly, you are queuing when you are on a waiting list for an elective surgery. So just very few examples. I'm sure you could list a lot more. So in a sentence, queuing theory is a mathematical approach to analyze waiting lines, basically. And the very basic graphical queuing process is as follows. A patient arrives into the system at a rate lambda. They join the queue, and as soon as the server becomes available, so server could be doctor in A&E, or it could be a bed in critical care, they go into service is at rate new, and then they leave the system. So when you studied your arrival process and your service process, you know your arrival rates, service rates, and number of servers. It's actually very easy using some maths to calculate average waiting time in queue, waiting time in system, average number of patients in queue, average number of patients in system, probability of all servers being idle, or in other words, no patients in the system, or probability of having n patients in the system. So the example where I've used queuing theory was looking at patient flow at critical care units at University Hospital of Wales in Cardiff. There were 2 types of patients coming in: emergency and elective, C beds, and we were able to show probabilities of having n beds occupied. And then using queuing theory.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Yeah, so in Namibia, the gentleman who was hosting these just kept on starting a story and repeating it. I don't actually remember what story it was.
Let's talk a bit longer.
Okay, now I have to. But at some point we got on this bus. Okay, carry on. Hold on.
Brilliant, thank you. Hi, my name's Tracy England. I'm one of the research associates here, and I also work for ABCI. And I'll be sort of following on from Isabella's to actually mention discrete event simulation. So I'm taking one of Lizzie's talks for next time. Discrete event simulation is basically a way so you can model a whole system as a sequence of discrete events, particularly useful if you're trying to look at the pathway of a patient in a hospital. Each event will occur at a specific instance in time, and the simulation allows you to keep track of your people in the system and the actual next event to be triggered. You can run the simulation several times and then look at the average of all those results, and it gives you a lot more information because it allows you to see the variability in the system. You can use available software. There are open source software. We tend to use Simulate, and we've used that quite a lot recently. Where I've used it, the trauma and orthopedic unit in Royal Gwent, and also in the glaucoma, lucentis, cornea, and paediatric outpatient clinics. But I've just started looking at the out-of-hours calls for ABMU and the calls to NHS Direct. So that's pretty much cool one. Useful because it allows you a visual representation that you can go and show to clinicians, and it's much easier than just taking a pad of pen and paper with maths on it, but actually showing them how the system's working, but on the computer. They can then make changes, you can change it while it's there, and it gives them an idea of a what-if scenario. It's a try before you buy, basically, so you can see a system in operation. Incorporate resources such as the nurses, receptionists, computers, all those types of things that you might want to look at and change. And then you can build in your distribution of time. So how long are different patients having their eyes tested, having drops, and you can build up a system. Then get some nice snazzy graphs and statistics out at the end that show the variation on your patients. And this is the glaucoma one that we've done recently. Patients arrive, they go into reception, they go into waiting room, have drops, wait a bit longer, see the consultant, they're out. So this is quite a simple flow diagram, but when it's actually operational, you see the patients move through the pathway, identify bottlenecks. And this is the one I'm working on at the moment, which is the call volume to the NHS. A lot more complicated, but even when the call volume's going through, you get an idea of what discrete event simulation can do. At the outcomes at the end and look at all the staff resources next. We're done.
Am I the only one that's twice?
I don't think so. Well, I know so. So we were in Namibia and we were supposed to get the transport back to our hotel. I'll finish that later.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm on twice. I wanted to also talk about system dynamics. I was aware they were talking about discrete event simulation and queuing theory. So system dynamics, I'm sorry, I'm bringing you back to a diagram that I showed earlier, but just to test your memory. So if you're thinking in terms of OR methods, quantitative and qualitative, system dynamics is kind of a blend of some qualitative aspects, but it's embedded within a quantitative model. So you're running a simulation model. The models are characterized by feedback and delays. What you're looking for is to try and represent the dynamic complexity of the system over time. So we could think of an example where we might use system dynamics, where maybe queuing theory and other methods might not be appropriate or suitable to the problem situation. So we might think about waiting lists, and we've got GPs who refer in for a particular type of surgery, and that leads to a certain waiting list size, and once patients are actually converted from the waiting list to being admitted, they're then occupying beds. But there's a feedback process that's going on within that, whereby the size of the waiting list is influenced by the number of people that are occupying the beds, and that bed occupancy is influenced by the referral rate. But similarly, there's also an effect on the referral rate, whereby GPs may moderate their referral behaviours in light of the size of the waiting list. So the number of hospital beds are influencing that's our capacity and influencing our occupancy. We've got a negative feedback loop in there, so that's what system dynamics is about, is identifying feedback loops within the system. We've also got a larger feedback loop going on here, where we've got the size of the waiting list influencing political pressure on the system. So maybe politicians deciding to change funding regimes for hospitals, which then leads to money for extra beds, which in turn increases the number of hospital beds and reduces our bed occupancy. So that's another negative feedback loop. We've also got an extra loop in there as well. So this might be our unintended consequences of having extra money available. So we've got a positive feedback loop here where as more money becomes available, we're then actually positively influencing the referral rate. So GPs are maybe that the system's able to cope a bit better with the demands being placed on them, and so they'll refer more patients in. So this is obviously just a word and arrow diagram at the moment and a really simple, very oversimplified case here. But what we could do is convert that into a simulation model. So we've got some stocks and flows here to represent patients arriving into the system or arriving into the waiting list and then occupying beds. And just like we built up the other diagram, we can then also model the number of beds, add in the loops, and essentially get behavior over time.
Right, Doris? So we missed our transport, and the gentleman we were with starts just basically flagging down buses, and I will finish that later.
Okay. In the meantime, I'm going to persuade you to use optimal control theory. Just when to use it. The problem you should consist of a single decision maker who's trying to optimize some objective over a particular period of time. And he or she does that subject to, something should happen, subject to a process that is described by a dynamical system. That is, the process describes something like the change of susceptibles over time, how they influence the change of infected people over time, how all of this affect the change in recovered people over time. For instance, what you get out of it is strategic answers, that is, optimal control interventions like vaccination strategies that respond to the current state of the system. So they are not frozen, they develop over time. And so you might have guessed a nice example of using it is any sort of epidemic process. It could be HIV, AIDS, influenza, but going further to diabetes, obesity, gambling, illicit drug consumption. And this is where a nice, convincing example comes from. It's let's imagine, let's travel back in time to the origins of the cocaine epidemic that hit the United States by the end of the last century and apply optimal dynamic control. And we spend, just imagine further, we set up a drug control budget, and that is proportional to the quantity consumed and allocated optimally to only demand-side interventions, leaving enforcement aside. And this is what can be done. So reducing the quantity consumed to about 1/4 of the peak level. And this, of course, is also useful if you don't travel back to actual problem. Thank you.
So we're nearing the end of the plan one. So if anyone would like to come join the queue, please do. I got to keep people actually care about a bus drive in Namibia. At some point, we had to deliver a fridge, which was terribly exciting and mildly terrifying. But yes.
Okay, I want to talk about behavioral OR only because it came up in a previous event when someone very prudently said about, well, how do you build in human behaviors into all of our models that you've seen, which is a real challenge. It's not by any means the answer, but just some ideas. So I've taken some examples from where we could go reach out to psychology and some of the models in the literature there. Things called agent-based simulation, which is a little bit different from what we've heard about already. Social networks, and then there's game theory, which we're going to talk about next. I won't talk about that now. But just one example about some psychological models. We worked on an example of looking at breast cancer screening. So from an OR perspective, it's a classical kind of OR model where you build a simulation model of a woman through her life course, where you have onset of cancer, if it happens. We have mathematical models for tumor growth, so we can see how the speed of tumor. So therefore, we can overlay all of this with some sort of screening program. And the whole point is, in a classical OR type way, we could look at the cost effectiveness of how often to screen, the frequency of screening, and the age of screening. But what was quite nice about this is that we knew from the study that only 70% of women attend for mammography. So the question is, why do 30% of women don't attend when you think it would be in their interest? So we reached out to psychologists at Canterbury and Kent, and they have a theory of planned behavior type models like this, which again, something completely new to me as an operational researcher, but basically it revolves around behavior as built on 3 constructs which can influence behaviors. And actually what's nice about this particular theory of planned behavior is it can be expressed quite mathematically. So the idea was to then embed the mathematical theory of planned behavior into our own individual women in our simulation model, and that allowed us to, for example, play around with, if you were to change behavior, for example, try to increase the uptake of mammography, would that be better money spent in terms of marketing, education campaigns, as opposed to increasing the frequency of screen, for example? So trying to build in behaviors. So that's one very quick example. Another one, and there's a paper there if anybody's particularly interested, was we have published on this. You can come and ask me later. An agent-based model is a bit like a simulation model you've just learned about, where you have a set of autonomous agents and they make decisions. It's a bit like a simulation discrete event, but where the agents have attitude. Okay, so you build in, the agents can be individuals, households, and so on. They are essentially decentralized. There's no place, there's no global system behavior would be defined, but the key thing is it's a concept of emergence. So out of all of this mess, some sort of phenomena about interactions arises, and agent-based models are used a lot, for example, traffic flows where you might get congestion on networks, evacuations, trying to model behaviors as people try to leave the building, and like flocking kind of ideas. And we use this in social network analysis as well. So agent-based models to look at smoking behaviors in adolescence and see how those smoking networks change over time and model behaviors in that way. Thank you.
So I believe I'm last, unless anyone else wants to jump in. So, go ahead. Yep. I'm going to talk very briefly about game theory. You might have heard of the prisoner's dilemma. The idea is 2 individuals have been caught and are separated. It happens in movies all the time. And if they both cooperate, so they both keep quiet, they'll both go to prison for 2 years. That's what's denoted here by the 2 and the 2. However, if one of them says no, the other person did it, so the person who controls the columns defects, they get a deal and send the other person to prison for 5 years while they go to prison for 0 years. However, if they both rat on each other, they'll both go to prison for 4 years. Now, the thing is, if you look at this for long enough, no matter what row we're in, the column it always benefits from defecting. So if you're keeping quiet, then I should rat on you because 0 is less than 2. And if you're ratting on me, then I should rat on you as well. So no matter what happens, I should defect. Obviously, the same logic applies to you. So we have a situation where if we both act completely rationally, we go to prison for twice as long as we could otherwise by acting in the correct way. Okay. So another example of this, that's a very basic example of game theory. It's kind of game theory 101. Another example of this is called Pigou's example. And these are used to study traffic. So the idea being, if we want to go from one point to the other when we're commuting, how should we do that in such a way that people don't have an incentive to use a road with less congestion, so as to equalize congestion? Paul and I wrote a paper where we applied this to hospital choices, and in particular to hospital choices when patients are trying to minimize the amount of time they're going to wait to join to receive service. So the idea was we have demand nodes, hospitals, and people can always choose to not go, and that can be at a particular cost. We used Wales as an example. We looked at knee surgery, and this is the corresponding routing game. So the same kind of diagram I just put up, that's the one we looked at. And the main results we had, we measured this thing called the price of anarchy, which is a very nice, bold name, but it's basically a measure of how much worse individuals are when they do the correct thing. And what we saw is, depending on the demand, we have quite the high price vanity where the wait could actually be twice as long. And in fact, the actual demand in Wales was here. So this article we started working on when there was a whole discussion about choice. And so that's one of the kind of things that game theory can be used for. A link to the article can be found there. Right, I believe that's it. So if I hand back to you. Anyone else? So yeah, go ahead. I think, yeah, start again.
Okay, great. So I hope you found that helpful. As I kind of, we thought the first one would be around the application of our technique. But by the way, in the future, people want to pitch up with a particular problem or throw it out, we hope to have that kind of a light and full session in order. So thank you for your attendance. I want to say the final thing. Julie's now been organising these seminars, but it's the 7th one. It's been fantastic, and again, maybe this out in all the organisations. Some of you might not know, but Julie's unfortunately leaving us from the help from the university side and working in the health service proper, yes. With a new job with CSU from summer. So this is your last time with your organizer. So as a token of our appreciation for all the effort put into this seminar series, we just have a small gift for you, Julie. So thank you very much. Okay, so we usually have the free. Well, what would we do without you? You come back and organise next one. So we usually have the about three or four times a year. So probably now will be sometime around the start of the summer, maybe September time. So until next time, thank you very much for attending.
I love it. I think it's oh yeah. Oh yeah. Let's stop the recording.
Well, if anybody wants a handbook or the right handbook, I've got 20 copies here.
I thought they were expensive.
They used to be £30. Well, there's only 20, so we'll see how many.